So, hi everyone, my name is Eilon, Director of Technology in Perfecto Mobile. I have here with me Carlo, Cadet. And today we are going to talk about continuous integration on mobile. It sounds like impossible mission. It is, but there are ways to solve it. So let's start to define what is the problem. And
Sure. For us, and perhaps just taking a step back, a couple people at the beginning had asked about who was Perfecto Mobile and kind of how we're in this conversation. And so, for those who were in the former session with David, I think you got an overview. For those who are joining, I'll just do a quick word. We provide two parts to the solution for mobile test automation. Number one, we provide a SaaS-based offering based on real devices. And based on one of the earlier conversations with a few of the gentlemen, we'll get into a conversation of why real versus emulators. And then second,
do you really believe we are going to have this conversation? This is conversations that we had 2 years ago.
I was surprised that someone said there's a good emulator and we're using it. I was surprised, Uzi.
But it cannot replace real devices.
That's
was my point. Okay.
I was surprised.
Fair.
And then secondly, in addition to the device cloud we have, it's probably my daughter, she always calls when I present, is that we support commercial and open source automation tools. So kind of the HP, IBM, Microsoft side of the house, as well as the Selenium, Calabash, Appium side of the house. We do that in support of both functional test, performance test, and monitoring. So that's just a word about Perfecto. And then getting this conversation going. The conversation that a lot of organizations are having right now is how do they extend their current automation, their automation practices, to the extent they have automation working on mobile, and bring it into their CI practice. That's the kind of a challenge that we've been hearing for quite a bit, and that's the focus of today's conversation. So let's just get a quick level set of the room. How many people are, just raise your hands if you're doing mobile projects, testing on mobile projects, great.
Of course,
Keep
this
your
is
hands
the
up
mobile
if you're
session.
doing automation, good. And leave your hands up if you're doing CI with those.
On real devices.
On real devices. Real
Nice.
Devices? Okay. Great, so that's about almost a third to half
Yeah.
I saw. So
It's better than last year. Much better.
Much better. Last year when we did this conversation,
It was one, if you remember.
yeah, there was one person who felt confident about what they were doing and a few other people who were experimenting quite a bit and just figuring it out. And so this conversation is really about how you're planning for that for extending automation to CI. We take a look at it from a couple of perspectives. Number one, taking a look at the build process, right? What should we be doing from a point of view of going on from at a per commit perspective, a nightly perspective, and a weekly perspective, and trying to understand what's required for automation to actually work in an unattended fashion. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time taking a look at that topic because we get a lot of feedback with various complaints. With regard specifically to breakage in the test suite, as well as skip tests. And the net effect is organizations are not getting the feedback that they're looking for, or their scope of automation that actually works in their CI practice is very small. It's limited just to their smoke, and they're not really able to inject their full regression suite into their CI practice. So that's the conversation that we're going to have today. And the presentation is now over. We could just go to the next slide, perhaps. All right. So we're going to talk about some of the changes that with mobile from a planning perspective. I gave you a quick tease with regards to the challenges. What we're all about is trying to share with you, and I always, when I present, look to learn. So I'll definitely be looking to get some feedback from you in terms of what patterns are actually working for you. And we'll, of course, give some examples of our own. But hopefully we can make this a two-way street in terms of a dialogue. And the net result is that we, as an organization, are constantly looking to kind of build out our own cookbook of what's required to get CI to work from a mobile perspective to get the test coverage and the device coverage that organizations are looking for.
You can skip it.
Yeah, we've been around for a little while. We work with some great organizations, and thankfully we're respected by a fair amount of organizations. How many people have heard of Perfecto Mobile? Good.
Not enough.
First timers who've never heard the brand Perfecto Mobile? All right, good. Awesome, thanks. Thanks for coming. All right, we set the conversation up sometimes by thinking about a specific persona, right? And I think this is the first thing that introduces the change, or what's the difference? The difference between web testing and mobile testing. I was with yesterday I had the opportunity to talk to a bank, one of the probably the big five in the world yesterday, and I was talking to their e-commerce leader. And I sit down, and the first thing out of his mouth is, mobile testing sucks. I'm like, hold it, what's that about? And what he was coming from is that in the scheme of things, automating web testing is fairly easy. The number of variables that you have to manage are fairly easy. When you talk about mobile testing, before you even get to the fact that you're running, you have a fundamental shift from thin client to fat client as you go from browsers to devices relying on local compute. You have this scenario that you see here, is that you have people who are moving around and changing context of how they're interacting with an application, and at the same time, the expectations they have of that application are consistent. They completely ignore the fact that their battery may be out. They maybe have 10 other applications. Their memory's low. They are constantly transitioning between Wi-Fi and cellular, as an example. And they have this constant expectation, and then you see that expectation communicated via ratings. And this is why I think that executive said yesterday that mobile test automation just sucks.
By the way, we have some customers that forgot to test what happened with incoming call. So we talked about emulator a little bit, but what happened if incoming call come? So it was a bank customer, and they have a very big form. And all the users need to fill up the form. But if there is an incoming call through this form, through this process, when you return from the call, the page been deleted. This is really annoying. Think about it, that you have the phone here, you have 20 fields that you already filled, and then suddenly incoming call. This is a phone. At the end, people would like to talk in this phone. So all these environment tests are very important. And when we are talking about mobile, you don't have to, you have to remember that we are talking about real devices that used for other things. It's not just your web. It's not just your PC.
Absolutely. And I look at ratings all the time for applications, and you look at the ratings and the negative ratings as well as the positive ratings. And what are you really seeing? You're seeing maybe a third comment. The first comment is something doesn't work. Okay, that's to be expected. I understand bugs get out, unfortunate, but it happens. The second comment that they frequently will be making is the performance of the application is not meeting expectations. And performance is a very large category of subjects. But unfortunately, a lot of people, and this transitions to the next slide, are focused first on does it work, but they don't necessarily recognize from a user experience perspective the expectation. And more so when that expectation is not achieved, how quickly people will move away from either completing that application or completing that essentially conversion in the application and either shift to a different channel or worse, shift to a different brand.
Together with that, just to lead us to this conversation about the performance tests and all the other tests, let's talk a little bit about the Agile. So we saw that all the mobile projects push the company to move to Agile. Who is actually doing Agile here?
Who thinks their organization has a very mature Agile practice?
Process?
Right.
So
that lines up to the data that we see, right? I've seen data that says, 93% of enterprises are doing Agile. And then when you get down to the question of how many are actually doing it in a fairly mature way, you get to these numbers that we just saw, right? It was probably about 10% of you who gave yourselves a report card of a mature Agile practice. Because there's a lot of breakage in that. And I think this is kind of illustrating that conversation. Uzi, why don't you drill in a little bit?
So let's think about what we are trying to achieve in the Agile. We're trying to have a short time to release our application. And why? Because in mobile, we are not controlling our release date. If Apple is going to release the iOS 9, we need to be prepared before. So now, our release date is actually, we get the release date by Apple and not by us. So that's something that actually changed all the concept of development. So we have a very short release term, but we have a lot of tests that we need to run, and we need to run it on different devices. And we need to run it with different parameters, environment parameter. We are going to drill down later. And suddenly, we have more tests and less time. And this is the problem. We have no time to test our application. And we must have real automation that actually works.
So Uzi, there are a number of organizations that I know I've interacted with. I assume you've interacted with the same and different ones. The whole transition as they're trying to get moving to mature their Agile practice is this issue of bye-bye to stabilization / hardening.
Exactly.
Right?
So
if their schedule is now compressing, from either it previously was a 12-week schedule, moving down to, let's just say, about a 4-week schedule, something in that neighborhood, even 4 to 6. That whole issue of having a parking lot available in the schedule called stabilization hardening, where they could do not only they could start performance testing is gone away. And they're having a very difficult time trying to understand how to bring those practices that they had allocated to that phase earlier into the cycle.
And this is why there are more bugs. And the bugs are not related to the functional test that we all familiar with, because the functional test been tested by the unit test. Most of the bug is it does not work on my new Samsung. It works on the old one, but it doesn't work on this one. We have a performance issue, as Carlo mentioned, and this kind of bug. And now you need to think to remember that your customers have a different devices. They want your application to work on their devices. It's really nice if it works on an emulator. I don't know any customer that actually use the emulator as his mobile device.
I got to jump in. I know we're going to have this, but you don't want to have this conversation. So we started before we started, you were saying, for example, that you used Genymotion as an Android emulator. Number one, you gave it a thumbs up for what it is as an emulator. But you said also, even though that's a good one, you're now moving or about to move to Real?
No, we use both.
You use both in parallel?
Yeah, so we use Real to test our actual app, and we use Genymotion to verify things that are hard to test on an actual phone, like battery drop below 15%.
Okay, so you could specifically throttle that on the emulator.
Genymotion has a Java API where you can set various parameters immediately, and so that passes our every check-in kind of test, and then we move on to hardware devices.
Okay, so it's almost a test coverage. It's a test coverage scenario that you're using both in parallel.
Yes.
In other words, there are some things that are just easier to execute, or rather more difficult to execute on a real device.
Yeah, and we still verify those before the actual release, but not every single time.
All right. So for those people who are doing automation earlier, how many people are doing on emulators only? Emulators only. All right. What's the thesis of that emulators only is sufficient? What kind of application? B2C, B2E?
That's true.
To use emulator, we can cover most of the popular ones.
All right. Again, so that sounds to me, if I could, and tell me if I'm misspeaking, it's an edge coverage issue. you're expanding coverage to a specific scenario, but all things being equal, you would use a real device. Okay? Is there somebody with a completely different story that says real devices are not worth it? All right. Good.
Numbers?
It's over. It's over. So, one of the things that we look at and is really the state of automation today. You know, so I was with an organization yesterday, as I mentioned, they have about a 12% automation rate. And this is an organization that's been around or have had a mobile application in market probably for 4 to 5 years. And they're struggling to achieve what I would say is a material level of automation. And particularly in the context of CI, right? If we want to be able to accelerate the process, if we say 12% for that organization or less than a third as a general statistic, what that says is CI is not working. Right? You really can't get the mobile test program inside of your CI pipeline because what that means is 2/3 of the test process is done manually. And if it's done manually, what that means is you're either allocating weeks that you don't have or you're proceeding with known risks when you make the decision to go, no-go from a release perspective, right? And as we've seen some organizations who are able to kind of bump up, and I think it's the leading edge. You know, it's perhaps for those few people who said they have a mature Agile practice, and part of that is not only automating the process, but automating the testing, is they're seeing numbers, let's just say, in the 70, 80, 90%. You know, and we're going to dig into what's this delta between, on average, less than a third, to what's really required to hit the velocity that this conversation's about. So, you know, I think this, we start, I think many of you are very familiar with this kind of framework, the test automation pyramid that was popularized by, I think, Mike Cohn back in the 2009 timeframe, right? He had a great thesis, right? In terms of how are you managing your automation investment, where should you be applying your investment? The investment should be applied in terms of at the unit test. Essentially, this is where the shift left conversation begins. The more that you're able to identify what's going on at the unit level, that's where you're going to be able to filter out a lot of the early defects. And then second is isolating out the services layer and focusing specifically your testing on that, you know, from a headless testing perspective. And I know some organizations do it both styles. And the theory was you want to minimize your UI testing. Why? Because the UI changes quite a bit. And this was the strategy that put forward. And for those people who kind of are familiar with this, you know, I think you also have to remember the ice cream cone view of this slide, which says, you know, there's always going to be some manual testing as well, right? Kind of keep the conversation grounded. But what really, that you take a look at this theory, and it's clear that the theory was baked around web. And so the question becomes, how do you take this strategy, this recommended approach, and how can you make it work for mobile? And so we've done quite a bit of thinking, and led by Uzi as well as our CTO office, in terms of what would we recommend to customers in terms of how do you adapt the thinking? Because this really starts at the planning level in terms of how to execute this conversation.
So let's try to analyze this theory. Does it work for mobile? We don't think so. And why? Let's go and see what we have in the market. And in the market, just so few examples, this is the most common error. It does not work with Android 5. Why? It works on Android 4, but it doesn't work on Android 5. You broke it. They broke it. It works. Everything was OK. New release, it broke it. And then, if we'll see here, most of the people are really happy, because most of the people have iOS devices, and it works on the iOS device, very common. But what about all the other? And it's not a lot of people, and you see that they have performance issue, they have a specific issue with devices, and this is actually what we are seeing in the market. Yes, it's 4-star, 3.5-star, which means that a lot of people that using the common devices, the application works for them. But if they are living, if they are traveling, if they have a different persona, if you remember the first slide, if they have a different persona, so suddenly the performance does not work. Suddenly they have a specific device issue. And why? Because 70% of all the error that we are seeing in the store, Google and Apple, are related to other tests that not covered by the unit test, like the load, like device coverage, OS coverage, and real network conditions. So this is why we understand that this theory is good for almost 4 stars, but not good enough. So we try to improve it. And the right way to improve it is actually to add more automation around the UI testing. Think about it, that you'll have one test, but you can run it more times with different devices. So now I have my one test, and I would like to execute it on 10 devices. And then I can change a little bit the environment parameter. I can change it from 2G to 3G. I can add a different location. So my testing, actually, or the full coverage of the testing is grow. And my confidence in my application become bigger. And on top of this, we have the performance test, and we have the security test that actually give us the full coverage of all the tests. And all of these kind of tests need to be run on mobile. And because we talked about Agile, and because we talked about that we are not controlling the dates, we must be able to run an automation. So we must have more automation regarding, or more UI automation, which is really hard to achieve. And we need to have more automation that played with the devices and can be executed on the different devices and with different parameters. Would you like to add something?
Yeah, taking a look at this representation, it really speaks to that the coverage model, the definition of what test cases are required for mobile is different.
That's true. So it's not. So the test case will be the same test case. So your UI test case will be go on the login scenario, check, deposit something, validate that the transaction works. But you need to execute it on 10 devices. So now you have one test that you need to execute 10 times. And then you need to say, OK, now I want to rotate the device, because the rotation really affects all the objects on the screen. So suddenly, and I have a lot of experience with mobile applications, I thought a lot of applications, when you rotate the device, there are no more buttons. So all these add-ons on top of the same test is actually a more execution, which reuse the same core of the test.
All right. So it's not more tests, it's more scenarios
More
to
executions.
drive each executions for each test case.
Now, if you can build your automation smart, you will be able to reuse the same test and execute it across devices and across the network parameters. So what I want to do now is to drill down, to give you a real example, even some code example. And let's talk about the problems that we have, and then what is the solution. The biggest problem is that we cannot add, it's really hard to add real devices to the CI processes. We just had the conversation before that to set up local labs, it's easy to set up, it's really hard to maintain. Why? Suddenly ADB command is disconnected. iOS device run of JUC when you run an automation on top of this. So all these kind of issues give you a lot of problem when we are talking about CI, because the devices need to be available all the time. That's the whole concept of CI, availability. So what is the right solution? The right solution is cloud. Why? Cloud is actually give you real devices and cloud with SLA, which promise that the devices will be available for you when the test or when the build need to be executed. So if we have our build 5 times a day, the devices should be there, available Why? Because this is a CI. This is a continuous process. It needs to continue. Parallel execution, also very important. So we have 20 devices. If I can't execute all my tests on the same devices on the same time, I did nothing. Because in this case, I will have to wait a lot of time. And then I will not be able to achieve my agile and my very short time frame. An attribute capability, I'll talk about it in an example. This is the attribute capability. When you select a device, if you are using a standard device or tethered device, you always have your own specific device that you are working on. If you are working on a cloud, you have hundreds of devices available for you. And what you need to do, and this is a desired capability, Java code, remote web driver, Selenium. So the idea is that I want to get my device. You can see that when I require the device from a cloud, I'm using the same capability. It's the same object, nothing proprietary to the Perfecto Mobile, but we added 2 more capability. I would like to get an Android with version 5 something. Add other property in order to get the next available device. So if a specific device had an issue, if a specific device used, you will be able to execute it on the next available device. So availability, SLA, is a very basic but most important phase to achieve CI.
Sounds like if it needs babysitting, it won't work.
Exactly, because it's CI. Another thing that we are talking about developing UI automations take too long. How do I test it on different devices? How do I maintain the objects? And automation required a lot of maintenance. So if I have one script and then I need to run it on iOS device, that's okay. And then on the tablet, I need to change it. And then on the Samsung, I need to change it. It's not a real automation. And then the process is not good enough. So what you need to have, and why? Because you have the script per platform, and the skill, the shifting of the skill, and this is something that happened in our customer today. It's not moved because the traditional testers, these organizations actually does not exist today. We have something we call it developer, test developer, something like this. The tester need to be more like a developer. They need to write a code. And this shift, we are on the way, but it's not there yet. So we need to help our organizations to bypass this challenge. And how to do that? First of all, you need to have a very clear and easy object identification for your mobile. I'll show you an example about it. Another thing, try to have a framework. Good framework will help you to create stable script and will help your tester to write a good automation. Reuse code, reuse function. I need to develop the login. 99% of my tests will use this login function. Don't run the login over and over. Develop it once, use it. It's like simple code. The same way that you are using when you are calling a database, you need to implement here when you are creating a mobile testing. And write cross-platform automation. I'll show you how to do it in a few examples. What I have here, I have a very nice example. This example actually taken from framework called Nemo. I have the, I'm very happy to see the one that actually created it. He will be in our booth later on if you would like to talk to him. So he developed an open source that allows you, it's a framework open source, which allows you to create a very simple automation. So you can see how easy it is to create the automation. You can write your test. You can define the test. Even your product owner will be able to define the test. And then you have the object repository. One place maintain all these objects. So you can see that I have my object and I found it by an ID. And I have an object and I can find it by Xpath. By the way, ID, if you have the options to ask your developer to add an ID, It will make your automation robust. And now the developer and the tester are working very close. Use it. Ask your developer to add an ID. It's going to improve your automation. And at the end, you have a very simple scenario that said, OK, find the element, find my last name, my email, my company name, and just send the key. So the tester will create the automation very simple. Yes, please. So that's a perfect question because I have a slide on it. Use an Xpath, but use a smart Xpath. So what I have here, I use an Xpath, and this is my application. This is a startup application. We have username here. We have username on email here. That's the login to Starbucks. So what I'm using here, I said, OK, use an Xpath. And what I decide is to use the contains. Why? Because I want the same code works on the iPhone and on the Android. I want to find the field with the property text contains username. So it works for this field and for this field. Native application? Yeah. Native application also have the option to get an XPath. You are getting the object tree, the native object tree, and you can go through XPath on this object tree. So use other property like text. If you want to come to our booth, I'll show you. We have two types of trees, and I can show you how does it look on UI automation trees, and how does it look on Perfecto Mobile trees. We support both of it, and the XPath works on all the trees. XPath is just a way to identify the object in tree.
So in addition as well, in addition to just all of the native properties that are associated in the various methods of locators, we also support, particularly for your scenario, visual-based, right? You could use some of the images.
I have slide on it.
As well as the OCR that this is referencing right now. So we're really emphasizing, in fact, you have to have almost mix and match according to what your local situation is. Why don't we pause and take a couple of questions that came in?
Yeah, I would not just say going to remove Xpath support in iPhone soon.
The comment is you believe that they're going to remove Xpath support?
Yeah, they're going to remove it in iPhone, so you will not be able to use it in application testing.
So I didn't hear about it, and I'm really active in this environment. They're going to they continue to support it. They have, and they're adding more options to identify the objects. There's something else that I just saw lately that Apple in iOS 9 going to have a new UI test options. And in this case, they are going to use directly with the Apple API to get the specific data. That's something that I read about it. Yes? So I'm not using the relative XPath. Fair. So in this case, what will not be changed? The location. I said, OK, always I have two. This is login field, right? I always have two text, edit text field. I will take for the first one and the second one. So I will be able to say, OK, find me by XPath the first text field and the second text field. This is something that will not be changed.
But it's also a second part to your question, and I'll fast forward to a slide that's later as well. The non-technical answer to your question is dev and test have got to work together, right? And the slide before that we were referencing really talked about coding practices, right? We have to move to dev to align to certain coding practices. Otherwise, automation can never catch up, and therefore the testing duration can never shrink. And so it's very difficult for one side of the team to reach their objective when the other side of the team is fighting against them. And so it has to be that culture and organizational structure support this. And this is why we see, number one, the QA profile shifting in many organizations to be more dev-like. And number two, we see some organizations who are kind of, I think, experimenting their way through this practice, where one sprint you're a developer, another sprint you're a tester, right? And they're pairing people off that way, specifically to break through, right? If I don't feel the pain of my action, I may not change. So forget to make Agile mature. It's not about only tools. It's about the rest of the stuff as well. So you can't not emphasize that enough.
I totally agree. I think this is the biggest issue. If you set up the environment and you have the stable environment, let's talk about false negative. So a lot of people say that they have a real automation. What is the percent of the false negative based execution that you have? Do you have a number?
Does anyone track metrics at this level?
About
10%. That's a very good number.
About 10%.
Okay, so let's say that you have thousands
In that
test
neighborhood?
cases, right? It's common to have thousands test cases. 10% false negative. It means that you have hundreds of tests that you need to analyze and to understand what happened. And if you run the test every hour, there is 100 tests that you need to drill down into the report, into the logs, and to understand what is the issue.
So how much time are you so for the 3 people who said 10%, how much time are you investing chasing down and reconciling false negatives?
I think in our case, we have categorized the flaky tests because we are measuring them over a period of time.
Okay, so you know this section, and you're ignoring them from the beginning.
From at least we're ignoring. They're both ignored because you get them every day, and you know that the features.
So let's,
And so have you considered just deleting them from the suite?
Yes.
And
so do it.
Yeah. Like those flaky tests are for 2 reasons, right? Whether it's an actual bug or it's a new test that was just added to the suite. So it's not.
Okay, so the test case itself hasn't settled down, right? Got it.
So we have a very simple rule that we are trying to have with our customer. Three strike and you're out. Delete it. You're not going to get any value for that. You need to achieve always green method CI. If there is a bug, if there is something that happened over and over and over, sure. So you find a bug. So go and grab the developer and tell him it's about time to fix your bug. What? And so what is actually the purpose of our test? We want to improve our user experience. And if we have a bug that is known bug, and you are agreed to have this bug, you don't need to run the test on top of this. Because it's a bug, it's known bug. Everybody knows that this bug is going out to the market. Remove it from the test. You don't need to test it.
That's not a bug anymore. Isn't that a feature?
Perfect. So, and the false negative is there is a lot of issue with the device. Sometimes the device is not available. Sometimes the device is not stable. So what we have, and this is very proprietary to Perfecto Mobile, we added 3 layers of controls that you can run on your test. So this is an example on on-error functions that I added. And what I have here, first of all, in case of error, I'm going to the home, device.home. It's close the application, it takes me to the home screen, and I try to run it again. Second, if it didn't help, I can have open and close the application. Let's play the application. Maybe it will help me. And the last thing, if nothing works, I can reboot the device. Today, some customers, we have few customers that decide we don't want to do that. What they are doing, they have, give me the same other device. So they are asking for a device, iOS 9, iOS 8, never mind. They are getting the device, they run the test, they got an error, they are going to the cloud, get the same device with the same property, execute the same script again. If they got error, this is the only way that they are going to reflect it to the CI. That's a very good implementation. It takes more time, but it's very stable. Mobile, because of the large number of tests, required almost always green methodology.
So it's not only always green, it's also unattended.
Unattended.
Right? It's being able to account
That's
for
true.
that scenario that we started with, that persona that we started with. So the reality is, on a real device, a phone call happens. You know, in a couple of weeks, what's going to happen for all the iOS users is iOS is going to say system update available in the middle of your test on a real device.
And unattended is very important. We talked about automation. I had a customer that his automation started always with manual action. This is not a real automation. This is not a real CI. So remember, unattended, everything should be unattended. Let's talk about the timing. It takes a lot of time. It runs on real devices. So the solution is parallel execution. And this is an example. You can use any mechanism to have parallel execution. This is a test-ng mechanism. I provide array of devices to my test, and it's going to run on all the devices. It's not just the devices, because Perfecto Mobile or any other cloud that you are using need to be a grid. If you are talking about mobile test, you should have the option to execute your test on PC, on standard browser as well. So this is a good way. Now I'm going to execute. This is, for example, responsive web design, web testing. So this is the way I'm going to execute it. Use it on iOS, on Android, on tablet, and in Chrome. I want to run it on 4 devices. The validation can be very simple. Just open everything, perform the login, and give me the screenshot and have some validation that everything looks OK. That's very good. That gives a lot of value. Anything to add? Perfect. It's like I paid you. You have the great questions all the time, because this is what I want to talk about it. How do you do the validation, the graphic validation?
Definitely a free T-shirt for you at the booth, okay, buddy? 2, maybe.
So we have an option to have a visual validation, not only a DOM/object tree validation, but also a visual validation. We are taking the screenshot from the device and analyze the screenshot, what we got from the device. And why it's so important? Because most of the problem with responsive web design or with rotation is actually not in the flow itself and not in the object, but on the display. So I have a great example. And in this, this is an M7, this is an M8, HTC, responsive web design. I rotated the device, and I don't know if you can see it, but these 2 big buttons, it's actually on top this frame. So no one can enter the value to this frame. If I'm going to the DOM object, all the objects are there. If I'm going to run an automation, go to the DOM and enter the value, that's perfect. It will work. Visual validation will find you this bug. And this is the way we are using it. Again, it can be executed from any API that we have. This is an example remote web driver. We're just switching the context, and the new context is visual, and we are going to run our visual analysis. So we have 5 more minutes, and let's talk a little bit about how to achieve a CI.
So we just went through a sequence of techniques, specific techniques to make, with the intention of making the automation itself more robust. But where we started in the conversation is really planning for it, right? That opening slide was really about how do you take a look at your CI program, your CI pipeline, and take a look at understanding what portion of my test suite do I want to execute to in what phase of my CI, right? If our goal is really delivering the feedback fast, we need to take a look and match what I'll describe as the scope of the quality program that we're going to inject at what point in time. And what we've had this conversation with a number of customers, and it's not that this is the right answer, so I want to make sure that I say that, but rather this provides a framework to start thinking about and planning and driving collaboration across dev, release, and test teams to understand what they're doing. And it helps from a point of view of planning in terms of understanding how to layer in device coverage. Do you really need to execute on every Android permutation for your build verification test? Maybe not necessary. But as a final compatibility test perspective, maybe you do want to have a greater degree of coverage. But it's a way about driving the conversation, because we find, with particularly as organizations are maturing their Agile practices, maturing their CI practice, you need to have this planning construct on the table as well.
And not only planning, but also you need to remember, this is a journey. So try to define the success criteria for each journey, for each step. For example, my first step is to have 5 tests that run on 2 devices for 2 weeks, unattended, really, on 5. And then you feel comfortable with the tool, you feel comfortable with the process, and then add more devices and add more the rotation, so network virtualization test. Try to define this kind of success criteria and follow it. It's a journey. And because we have 1 more minute, there is another slide that I just want to show. I don't like this slide, but it's very, very important. This is the slide.
So, throughout this conversation, right, it really comes back time and time again to this conversation, right? It's not that automation tools suck. That's not the case. It's not the case that there aren't an adequate set of techniques available to apply to achieve this goal from I have an automation test script to something that actually runs, on an unattended basis. But you get the scenarios that we heard in this conversation, right? Every cycle, QA identifies a bug, and dev never fixes it, and we run the same test again and get into the same conversation.
Or developer change the Xpath.
Or developer change Xpath or the ID.
Exactly.
As an example. Or there are just random practices across, the iOS native team and the Android native team. And the question becomes is, how does the larger organization align to the objective of achieving the desired velocity? And we have to take a look at some of the practices in terms of, what can the organization do to support the practice? Because there's no way, from an automation test code perspective, going to achieve the correct velocity to support the cycle time, right? You're not going to be able to get the product out of the door or complete the testing in time when other parts of the organization are not collaborating with you. And so, as much as we want to stress, specific techniques, we also have to stress in terms of how people interact and getting people to play nice together with one another.
That's true. It's not only tools, it's also people.
All right. With that, I want to thank you very much. For the most part, one of the objectives that I have when we present is that we finish talking before most of you finish listening, and I think we've achieved that. But we'll be happy to take any questions that you might have at this time.
So I came down and spoke with you guys briefly before, but as far as running in-house and handling things like needing to use USB hosts on the device, how does Perfecto handle that?
In terms of how are we driving the device?
Yeah.
So it's a USB connection that we're able to A, drive the device operations, and B, grab the stream off.
So is that the only way that you can interact with the device?
No. We have, it's more related to gaming options, but they want to run the test. So when the game opens, they're listening to a specific TCP port, and we are connecting via Telnet, via the internet, and run an automation test via this platform as well.
Because like for almost all of our apps, we require USB hosts, which means we can't be hooked up to ADB.
Oh.
Yeah.
At least not through USB.
But in this case, what we can do is actually to close the data and give you the access to the ADB, or we have a proxy. We can have a proxy way to the ADB, so you can run an automated test directly to the ADB. We have it. It's open. It's available. It's not open to all the customers, only on private clouds, but something that's doable.
Let's talk about that a little later on. Any other general questions? Way back in the back.
I've seen your presentation before a couple years ago. I tried to ask, how do you guys handle iOS native system dialog messages without jailbreaking the device? And I think back then you guys said it was kind of proprietary, but I don't know, is there any insight that you can give us how you actually control or click on the OK button on a system dialog message?
So the way, so today it's really easy. UI Automator allowed you to do that.
So the problem is our UI Automator is always stuck within the sandbox of our app.
So the way that we just, the things that we achieved is the option to allow you to get all the UI automation to work directly on the application without jailbreak the device or without instrument the application. That's actually the power of Perfecto Mobile. So you can run all the tests that you have today, but you don't need to run it from the sandbox. That's the magic.
So you raise a good point, which is some of the capabilities that we have are what I would describe as off-the-shelf capabilities, right? They're inherited. If we support remote WebDriver, we inherit all the languages as an example. But there are other capabilities that because this is our business to support organizations, we have developed our own IP to solve some of these problems. Because we're kind of, I would say, more committed to helping you achieve that unattended execution in parallel, right? As opposed to being dogmatic and supporting only a specific capability that perhaps an open source tool or commercial tool provides. You know, there's a reason why we're leads in the space.
You can come to our booth and talk about more
Do you support running against central systems, like test systems, because if you want to test
Backends, you mean?
Yes.
Environments?
Yeah.
Sure. It's like VPN. Yes. We provide you several options in terms of how to achieve the connectivity.
like the video analysis, like analyzing the quality of the video that's playing?
Great. It's something that's right now in our backlog. And, you know, I'd love to talk to you a little bit more because right now we're in a requirements gathering phase. So if you could stick around, we'd love it, or you could stop by the booth. iOS 9, we've been supporting every beta release, so our customers have had access to the beta releases, and we're anticipating right now, if the rumors are true, Apple's going to announce on the 9th. We have a patch release that will be released on the 10th. So we, 3 weeks ago, we supported in our release beta 5, and so we just have to make sure that we do a final QA check to make sure nothing changes between beta 5 and the GA version. How? Sure. So, you know, there's two parts to this, right? So, okay. The last comment has come forward, but the last comment is that if you say Appium or remote WebDriver, it's a listener, we do device operations back, and we pass that command forward into our own back end, and our device operations is how Perfecto does it, and not confined to how Appium or Selenium operate. So we have our own unique device operations, and in fact, we extend both Appium and Selenium capabilities with these device operations. So some of the things, for example, what we refer to as system-level control, or the ability to handle system notifications, those are extensions, right? So we've made a number of extensions. With that, I thank you.